my name is Amy Verdun and I'm here with Professor Assem Dandashly from Maastricht University to talk about the European Neighbourhood Policy. So Assem, what is the European Neighbourhood Policy and what are some of the challenges?
The European Neighbourhood Policy was launched in 2003 and was developed in 2004. And the main aim for that was to avoid having new dividing lines in Europe after the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War. With the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, in which 10 new member states acceded to the EU, we had new borders for the European Union, to the east and to the south. With the east, with the eastern enlargement in 2004, and also with the southern neighbors, we had Cyprus and Malta joining the EU, in which the borders of the EU got closer to the southern neighbors. So in a way, this was one of the main aims of the neighborhood policy, is to avoid having dividing lines in Europe, and also to be surrounded by a ring of friends and not conflicting countries surrounding the EU. So well-governed countries, good neighbors, strong economic development in those countries, good relations, good trade relations with the EU, and of course promoting democracy, human rights, civil liberties in those countries.
The European Neighbourhood Policy applies to both its eastern and its southern neighbourhood. What are the specific challenges in each of these contexts? How has the European Neighbourhood Policy been impacted by political developments such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the so-called Arab Spring?
With the European Neighbourhood Policy, or ENP, grouping those two regions in under one umbrella, the ENP, was already problematic because of the differences and the challenges that each region faces. If we look at the east, the presence of Russia, which was, we saw what happened with the Georgia-Russia war, and then like the annexation of Crimea, and more recently the invasion of Ukraine. I will elaborate on this in a bit, but this is one of the main geopolitical challenges and security challenges for the EU. But at the same time, there's the problem of democracy, human rights, corruption in the region that still poses challenges for the EU. When we look at the southern neighbors, what we see is several challenges that relates to security issues. Illegal migration, cross-borders terrorism, problems of not well-governed countries, authoritarianism, deterioration in terms of human rights, democracy, failed states, conflicts. So there's a lot of problems that the southern ENP countries have when it comes to posing challenges to the EU. With the Arab uprising, more challenges were posed to the EU. The Libya crisis, the conflict in Libya, which is still not solved, and it poses a lot of threat to the EU in terms of security, in terms of illegal migration. And also we have the Syria war, which is still a conflict zone. It has it's a bit more stable compared to the previous years, but it's still ongoing. It's not stable in that region. So we could see that there are a lot of challenges, and it's very unstable region, especially on the eastern side. We don't know what will happen with the current war on Ukraine and how it will end, because it will have significant effects on the neighborhood policy, on the security of the EU, and also on other areas within the European foreign and security policy.
How does the European Neighbourhood Policy function in practice? What kinds of agreements and relationships are involved?
ENP functions, there's a lot of similarities with the enlargement policy. As I said in answering question one, like it's everything but the institutions. So a lot of terms that that are applied to the in the enlargement process do also apply to a certain extent in the neighborhood policy. Now, the neighborhood policy is based on the association agreements, which are signed with the neighboring countries, and there are action plans, and the action plans differ slightly based on the country. So some countries do have action plans and work on that, and they are changed, like they are renewed every 3 to 5 years, updated, more cooperation, and there are different funding schemes that the EU applies with those within those action plans, and a lot of support goes to the market, development policies, strengthening democracy, human rights, well-functioning institutions. So we see a lot of support, not only in terms of financial support, but also knowledge transfer and know-how to those countries in order to develop their countries and move closer to being more integrated with the EU. Add to this that there's also, with the climate challenges to the entire globe, that this is also a salient issue in the action plans or in the negotiations and also in the agreements that the EU has with those countries. To add, there's also the mobility partnerships, the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. There's also the access to the market, the money that the EU spends and in support of those countries in order to move forward with respect to development on all the different areas that I just mentioned, from hard security to energy security to climate change, to statehood issues, to conflict resolution, combating terrorism, combating illegal refugee and illegal migration, border control, corruption, transparency, etc. So we see a lot of areas that the EU focuses on are basically focusing on issues that will help in creating what the main aim of ENP is: a ring of well-governed, friendly states surrounding the EU.
If we think about Canada, is there any set of policies that could be compared to the European Neighbourhood Policy?
This is a hard question. But when we think about Canada and its neighbors, we have the neighbor that Canada shares borders with is the U.S. It's a well-governed, democratic state. While if we look at and it's the larger member in that relation, because the economy, the military, etc., are much larger than Canada. When we look at the neighboring countries, the EU is sort of the big member here, and all the neighboring countries are the weaker, smaller states. However, the biggest problem that the EU faces, which Canada doesn't face, is the EU. All these countries, or most of them, are not stable countries. They are not well governed. They are governed by dictatorships. The rule of law doesn't exist. Democracy doesn't exist in the same way that we have in Canada or the US. Canada doesn't have an issue with the US because, as I said, it is a democracy. Now, some issues were during the previous presidency that affected the relations somehow, but again, we know that in democracies, institutions are really strong and continue and are, even if the presidency changes, the continuity of the policies or the continuity of relationships are way beyond the presidency. So this is one issue. The second thing is, because of the climate change and the melting ice crust in the Arctic, this might create some challenges and opportunities, because more countries are involved in that in the Arctic region. Not only Canada, the US, Scandinavian countries, Russia, and each one of these countries want to explore and see the opportunities that will come from the economic opportunities and the resources that they can explore in that region. And this might create some challenges and, to a certain extent, conflicts.
How would you evaluate the success of the European Neighbourhood Policy? Would you recommend any changes to it?
Talking about success and failure is not always easy, especially with a policy that covers a lot of areas. And in order to assess the European Neighbourhood Policy, we have to look at the different policy areas that it focuses on. So if we take, for example, democracy promotion, we see that in the best scenario this has been a limited success. And if you look at all the neighboring countries, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, toward the east and also toward the south, we see that there have been problems of corruption, lack of transparency, problems in the rule of law, minority rights, gender equality. So there's tons of problems that relates to democracy and human rights and well-governed states. And this was both in the east and in the south, although in the south it's more problematic compared to the east. So this is in terms of democracy. So we cannot say that it has been successful. It ranges between very limited success to a failure in some countries, as we see in a lot of the Middle East and North African countries that are part of ENP. Now, in terms of security, we see that this is one of the issues that the EU focused a lot on. And if we look at the literature on the European Neighbourhood Policy, there's always this competition between security and democracy, and there's a prioritization of security because there's a lot of borders that the EU shares, especially with the southern neighbors, and the main issue is about security. It's about border control, fighting illegal migration. And this has been, to a certain extent, not successful, but maintained to a certain extent. But with the chaos that happened because of the Arab uprising, we saw that there was a lot of pressure on issues related to security and illegal migration, and we're still facing it until now. Which brings me basically to the third issue, is conflict in the region. And this is in terms of conflict resolution, the EU hasn't been that successful, especially when it came to Libya, when it came to Syria, for example, which created the major threats to the EU security in terms of illegal migration and refugee. And we all still remember the refugee crisis of the 2015. So in that sense, this is also an area that hasn't been that successful. Now, in terms of trade, economic development, this has been one of the most successful areas in which there is more integration between the EU and the neighboring countries. And this is something that has always been the case. And as I said before, the EU the European community, even before the EU, had commercial agreements, trade agreements with those countries that date back to the even before the establishment of the European Union. Now, another areas that are important and still needs a lot of work: climate change, energy security, humanitarian problems in those countries. And I think this is something that is ongoing, and this needs the collaboration not only from the EU but also from other countries and the entire world in terms of combating climate change, which is having a direct effect on migration, on development, not only in the MENA region or the Middle East and North African countries, but also in other countries in Africa and other parts of the world. Now, what can be changed in the ENP? And I think one of the key issues is we saw that with the more pragmatism of the EU is the toning down of the language on democracy. One of the problems that the EU faces when it is dealing with the third countries in both neighborhoods is the focus on the Eurocentric approach, especially when it comes to values, Western liberal democracy type that the EU tries to promote. And I think one of the key things is to give more voice to the local agencies in those countries. What do the people of the regions want? in terms of human rights, democracy, stability, fighting corruption, transparency, etc. And this is something that is important, is to decenter the EU approach to those regions and not to come with this Western mentality that whatever we're offering is the best and you have to take it. And I think this is changing in the EU discourse, and we see this more in the recent development in the relations with the neighboring countries. But unfortunately, with the war in Ukraine, things have been all the focus has moved to the war on Ukraine.
So Professor Dandashly, that's a lot to digest. There's so many things going on right now in the world, and my goodness, you have to cover all of this in only one chapter, together with Gabriela Kira, who was a co-author of this paper. So thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts with us today, and I hope the students will benefit from all of these deep thoughts that you've provided us.
Well, it was my pleasure to talk about ENP, which is a really tough policy, and it's just things are changing really fast to try to cover all of this in such a short time and also in these few minutes. So thank you so much for having me and for the conversation.